begin?
So we have 3 people. We're going to follow the usual process. We have 3 people that signed up for public comment. I'm going to pull the list right now to make sure I'm catching everybody. But in the meantime, if anybody would like to provide public comment and hasn't signed up on the usual form, they are invited to do so by raising their hand with the button at the bottom of their screen, and we will unmute them after people that have signed up have spoken. So we are going to start with Mr. Sutton.
Okay.
I am going to unmute him, and he should be able to provide his comment.
Yep. Hi, Carlos.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I want to thank you for this opportunity to address some of the concerns that I have. And first, I want to thank you for the things that you're doing to address the housing problems and things that we have here in Evanston. But I just want to comment briefly about, I'm still a little bit confused about the difficulties of getting any kind of assistance to small landlords who have suffered adversely from tenants who could not be evicted during the COVID-19. And why is it that you could give $50,000 to businessmen on Main Street for their loss, but yet we have to show our tax returns, and then you're talking about a minimum amount of about $12,000? I would rather not apply for a program that has all those kinds of commitments. When I see the city spending $1 million to repair the floor on Robert Crown, when I see the city spending money on so many other things that I think are necessary, but still not addressing the needs of taxpayers in this community that have paid taxes for decades. And when we ask for a minimum amount of assistance, the only thing we get is the runaround. So I thank you for addressing the concern, but I'm very concerned about the kinds of bureaucracy and requirements for the minimum amount that you plan to give to small landlords that have units of 0 to 35. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. The next person is going to be Gail Schechter.
Okay.
I am Ms. Schechter. You should be able to speak now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hi, Gail.
Oh, terrific. Hi, thanks. It's good to be here. I also am speaking on the ARPA funds for small and medium-sized landlords, and I think this is a great initiative. And I read the memo. The only thing that I would suggest is making it clear, bumping up the eligibility for landlords that rent to low income residents. So otherwise, the way it reads, even though it says that there's an affordable housing benefit, it would be good if there was a preference for those who are renting to households with low incomes. But I do think it's a great idea, because most of the naturally occurring affordable housing stock is owned by, quote unquote, mom and pop landlords. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gail.
Thank you. The next person is Tina Peyton. Ms. Peyton, you should be able to speak.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Tina. Hi.
Hi. I'm speaking also on the same subject of affordable housing. And I do as well appreciate you attempting to help the landlords with this repair. Unfortunately, I feel very slighted by the amount of 12 to 15,000. And just like Carla said, the people on Main Street had a 2 months of construction in front of their business, and they were offered 50,000, and that was for construction. So ask yourself, how much do you really care about affordable housing? The Dog Beach is open. You all talked about Dog Beach at City Council. And that was spoken to by a few people that said, we need the Dog Beach open. So now it looks like still you're concerned more about cats and dogs than you are about affordable housing and the landlords that provide it. This $12,000 or $15,000 does not even cover the damages that was left by the two Connections family that abandoned my, left the place in shambles. And anybody could apply. You said 1 to 35 units. And so maybe there was a landlord that wasn't even devastated and they could apply and get the money. There's a person presenting tonight that you all gave $1 million. So they're gonna put some insulation in some people's homes and they get $1 million. I hope that you think about this again. And the length of time that you're discussing to even give us any money, you're talking about February now. How long do we have to wait? I will not be able to sustain helping over 50 years in this community. And it feels like a slap in the face when now there's very little ARPA money left and you can't dedicate any money of substantial reasoning. This is, you gave $2 million to Northlight. So you're now saying entertainment is even more valuable than being a landlord here in Evanston that provides something you say we don't have enough of. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. And then Marion, you said we got some email comments, did we? Or
Yes, we did. We got a comment from James A. Mackey, who is a landlord, and he wasn't able to attend, so he provided written comments. So I can read the comment.
yeah,
He thinks the best way to capture lost income effect from the pandemic would be to compare 2021 income to 2019. That should be relatively straightforward for most landlord. And it would be a reasonable assumption that a drop in income between these years, if there's one, is likely due to the pandemic.
Mhm.
Taking 75% of this loss in income would seem to make sense as the relief program became effective when there were 9 months remaining in 2021. He doesn't know if there was anything scientific about limiting the program to landlords with 36 or fewer units, and he understands there's a line that needs to be drawn somewhere. Unfortunately, from his own situation, he's just above this with 39 units, and he's disappointed that it's so close, but he wouldn't be eligible. He's wondering if the committee could consider going to a higher limit than 36 for a situation like his, maybe for landlords that rent like him, mostly to low-income tenants, or just suggest a way to measure looking at the percentage of total apartment rented to tenants who have Section 8 vouchers, and maybe establishing a minimum threshold of 10 or 20% for eligibility. And then finally, he would like to be able to share that he wants to clarify comments he's made about vacancy being a factor in reduced state rental income. He had mentioned that was an issue. He can tell from his experience that there's no problem renting available units in Evanston. The issue has been dealing with tenants who were unable to pay rent due to increased costs and difficulty of getting units prepared for rental. There were a shortage of various contractor, especially earlier in the pandemic, and essentially that extended quite a bit vacancies and therefore loss of income. there's several of the tenants that had financial difficulties and were able to obtain rent relief, but there's some that either didn't succeed or chose not to do so. And he had a loss of income in those cases as well.
It'd be good if you could forward all that to the committee, because it sounds as though it's looking like we're not going to have a meeting tonight. So it'd be really good for us to be able to read through all that extensive comment.
Yes, I absolutely can share those comments by email with the committee.
Okay.
And then I have one other person signed up for comments, but I'm actually not sure of what the procedure is in this case. I have a city council member that is signed up for public comment, and I don't know what the process is in the case of public comment for HCDC.
I think that's okay, because
should.
the committees that where you can't do that is like the land use commission.
Okay,
Be-
wonderful. So I have council member Claire Kelly that would like to provide some comments,
Okay,
and you should be able to speak right now, council member Kelly.
Great, thank you so much. I wasn't sure either how that works in terms of the rules, but thank you. And thank you, I really appreciate that this committee is discussing and moving forward on hopefully allocating funding for our small and medium-sized landlords. And I would have to second what Ms. Schechter said in terms of prioritizing those who are providing affordable housing. It's so important that we preserve our natural housing stock, and particularly our mom and pop stock. It's important that our city is integrated and that we have affordable housing spread out throughout Evanston. And I would just ask that we really remove any sort of bureaucratic obstacles and really expedite the allocation of this funding. I think this housing stock is so important to us in Evanston. Again, as it's spread out, smaller buildings, and again, more deeply integrating our city as opposed to just single locations, but spread out with with this naturally occurring housing stock. I'd also ask that we really do look at and consider the amount that we're allocating, and really consider it might be necessary to increase that amount. It is just so important to maintain this housing and to look at what else we can do to support it. It's just, I think the city in the past obviously has not been supporting this housing enough. And it's really precious to our city, precious to the goals of affordable housing. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. We had one more person that signed up as their hand raised. So Mr. Clay Lawhead. Oh, they decided not to. Oh, no, never mind. Mr. Lawhead, you should be able to speak now.
Sorry, my bad. Hi, everybody. I am a senior at Northwestern University. I'm 22 years old. I live in Evanston, and I just wanted to say, like, my pieces of what I've been thinking the last couple of months and years living here. I've been disappointed at the city about the housing situation. Coming here to look at low-income student, I have not really been well received in Evanston as finding housing. There's been virtually no off-campus supported by the university housing. I started looking in January and couldn't find any housing at all. As you might know, students look for it very, very early, and had to pay a lot of money for living so close to campus because I don't have any communication or ways to get to campus besides walking. And I'm paying a lot out of my budget, as well as, like, I think a house would have been a great choice for me. However, the brothel law, I'm not able to get a house that's affordable for me because of that reason and that reason only. And my friends and my experience is that I have found that most landlords that I've been with have not been reliable in terms of finding affordable housing. And I know that there's housing that's about 20 minutes away that's affordable, but of course the CTA is not at this point a reliable source of transportation that they're on time. And I really urge this committee to look into, like, the connection with students. A lot of students come to the school and that are low income that really cannot afford to live here, and they kind of leave being disappointed in Evanston as a housing situation. especially due to the brothel law and due to the lack of multifamily housing that is off campus, that is close by. And I also wanted to say that a lot of it has to do also with the way that the city is trending towards raising rent and raising the price of a lot of restaurants that are nearby in Evanston. I know that in the past 4 years, I've seen Burger King go away, I've seen Panera go away, I've seen other places go away. And what has replaced them is very expensive places to eat. And I know that the rents of those places in terms of buildings have skyrocketed in terms of things like Burger King. And that contributes a lot to like affordable places to eat as well. Spend a lot of money on food and spend a lot of money on groceries. We can't afford also to pay rent as that high. And so I really urge the city to look into like, I'm not sure, some kind of subsidization, subsidizing these houses, subsidizing these restaurants in order to actually offer affordable low-income housing here. And so, yeah, I just wanted to bring that up as a student and say that I'm leaving this university not very impressed with the way that Evanston has coordinated with university in terms of finding affordable housing for students and student housing in itself. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
So this sounds like this is the end of our public comment time. It doesn't look like Councilmember Reed or Burns have joined. I'm wondering if there's any way to at least proceed with the presentation from our guests tonight, given there's no vote.
About the one-stop shop, you mean?
Mhm.
Yes.
But does it, I mean, no offense, does it make sense though? Because ultimately, don't we have to vote to proceed, or?
No,
No, it's just an update.
It's the update, okay. But
Right,
there was gonna be, I mean, there's gonna be discussion of an advisory committee.
right,
so-
right.
so we can do all that without. everyone else?
I think we might want to wait on the discussion of
yeah,
advisory committee, but and we might want to have our guests come back again next month as well. But if they're here and I'm eager to just hear where we are with the program.
Okay, yeah,
And then-
absolutely.
and then we'll probably plan to ask them to come back again to help launch the discussion about the advisory group.
And it's being recorded, so folks that are absent can watch on their own time and be ready to
That's a
discuss.
good
when we come
point.
back.
That's a
Right,
good point.
yeah,
So
good
does
call.
this meeting not get rescheduled like for next week or anything? Is it sort of?
That's given calendars.
Yeah,
I-
that's fine. That's, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
and welcome Bob Dean. Bob Dean is joined as panelist. Thank you for your patience. We also have Kara Pratt.
Okay.
I have the slides that you were looking to present. Bob, I don't know if you have an updated version, I can also try to see if you're able to share them, but otherwise I'm happy to share my screen.
Yeah, you can just use those, Marion. There weren't any updates. We may have Robbie Marcus also here, and he might be involved in answering questions. So if you could promote him too, that'd be great.
Thank you for the reminder.
Sure.
So I think you've presented a couple times before, Bob. Thank you for joining. I'm going to go right into the slideshow unless you wanted to provide any kind of introduction to your presentation.
No, that sounds good. You can queue it up and I'll just talk through it.
Great.
Okay.
There you go. Okay, thank you, Marion. Sec while I arrange things on my screen here. Yeah, well, thank you for having us here and also for supporting this project when it was presented to you over the summer. I'm Bob Dean with CNT. Also here is Robbie Marcus with the Evanston Development Co-op. And we wanted to refresh your memory about project scope, timeline, and rules, and talk about some of the decisions we've been making. We did want to spend a fair amount of time tonight talking about the advisory group that we'd like to form, which is not going to require a vote by your committee, but if you would like to hold that discussion until everybody's here, that's fine. So I'll get through the first half and then you can see if you want to proceed with us talking more about the advisory group. We're still in the process of getting all of the administrative requirements that are needed for this program going with the city, but I think we're close enough to getting it done that it's worthwhile to really start planning for startup here. So the program basics are on this slide here that Marianne is sharing. It's a pilot project meant to improve the energy efficiency, climate resilience, and overall health of existing affordable housing units in the city. So this program was recommended in a planning study that C&T did with the city, which was funded through a National Partners for Places grant. And really that's where the idea for this originated. It's also consistent with the climate action and resilience plan adopted by the city a couple of years ago. So we have the twin goals here that we're very intent on the one hand, improving sustainability and resilience, and on the other hand, advancing equity. And those both are important elements of this program and also of C&T's mission. So we're excited to be working on this here. With the funding that we have, which is $1 million from ARPA, we expect to make improvements to around 50 housing units with a mixture of single family and multifamily. And we're continuing to propose, like we did when we put this out, to focus these in neighborhoods with the highest concentrations of need. So in the 5th Ward, in areas of the 2nd Ward, near the high school, and the eastern part of the 8th Ward on the Chicago border. So that corresponds with census tracts 8092, 8096, and 8102 for those people who think about census tracts. So this is meant to improve these particular units, but also do a few other things. We really want here to build contractor capacity to do these types of improvements, because we expect demand for this sort of work should rise in the future, and we'd like to have Evanston housed contractors ready to do it. And as a pilot, we also want to test the model of a comprehensive rather than a single purpose approach to housing rehab, or instead of applying separately for a number of improvements, you can get screened and qualified for a number of things that your home needs all at once. We hope to attract resources from other programs to complement the $1 million in ARPA funding that's already been put in. For example, funding for lead service line replacement or for solar installation, for example, could be added to this program and then rolled out in the same way. So next slide, please. So the schedule here, which was in your materials too, is really just meant to show a staggered approach to construction. The green here are the places where we'll be actually in units doing construction work. And this is meant as an illustration. Things probably won't fall exactly like this, but the general concept is to start the on-the-ground work in homes in about March and to be complete by fall of 2024, with then monitoring and documentation of impacts to follow. So what this slide also shows is the range of building types. We're intending to do a mix of single family and multifamily. So our plan right now is to serve about 50 units. That's gonna depend on exactly how much everything costs once we get in there and prioritize, but some are multiple units in one building. And so when this actually rolls out, it may be more in the range of 14 buildings are served approximately, because there's going to be, again, as many as 20 units in some of these. Next slide, please. And there are 3 organizations involved in the project team. I'm with C&T, we hold the official contract with the city. We'll be staying a step away from the actual construction work, which gives us the ability to provide broader kind of oversight and evaluation of how the program is going. I'll be the lead contact with the city and with you. I'm the CEO of C&T and also an Evanston resident. I was one of the volunteers who worked on the climate plan a couple of years ago, which is why I'm getting personally involved in being your lead for this project. We're partnering with Elevate, who does this type of work as their regular business across the country, and they're really providing their technical expertise throughout. And then EDC, Evanston Development, is our main point of contact for residents and contractors, and will provide participant intake, construction management, and contractor coordination. So in the study that recommended this program, we found that having a local mission-driven organization be the lead for resident interaction was really important in terms of building trust with residents and in terms of letting the program be sustained over time. So next slide, maybe. So one of the items we want to talk about today was the advisory group that we would like to form to help us answer some program design questions prior to launch. So I wanted to do that, but wanted to pause anyway for questions or thoughts and see if there's anything on what I've said so far, which is meant to be a refresh, but I wanted to get everybody on the same page before we ask questions about what's next. So
I'm going to quickly interject. Thanks for your presentation. Just want to mention that Councilmember Burns has joined, which means that we can proceed with the meeting as planned.
Great.
Yeah, just so does anybody have a question about sort of this overview of the program? So I guess I do have one question. So you mentioned the census tracts, where the focus will be. Does that mean a building that's not within one of those areas won't be eligible? Is it truly going to be really focused?
We actually need to answer that question. That's one of the things we want an advisory group to advise on, because it could either be a requirement or a preference. And so I think we don't know yet. We'd like to talk about the pros and cons of both of those. So I think that's a very good question and a decision still to be made.
Anybody else have a thought or a question at this point? Well, then let's talk a little bit about the advisory group and how this group will assist in the program and
Okay.
what you're thinking.
Thank you. I'd be happy to. So I have 3 slides on this, so I'll just roll through all 3, and then we can have some Q&A. So the purpose of the advisory group that we're recommending here is to provide a community voice as we're rolling out the program and evaluating its success. We want to have a variety of perspectives represented on there so that we get a range of feedback. We're thinking of the group as up to 12 stakeholders. It doesn't have to be quite that big. It could be a little bit smaller. And we have some budget that we allocated in our proposal for modest stipends for anyone who we want to invite who would have trouble participating without them. We expect relatively frequent meetings during program design. So prior to launch, we want to have the group meet about monthly, and then fewer during implementation and probably once after completion to talk about how it went. So that's probably 6 to 8 meetings overall over the course of the program. Could you go to the next slide, please? And there are a number of questions that we would like to discuss with the group. One is how to recruit participants. This is a relatively small pilot. As I said, we're going to serve about 50 units, and that may be as small as 14 property owners actually get engaged. So we don't want thousands of applicants, meaning that we're proposing to do, since this is a pilot, some targeted recruitment rather than broad advertisement. I'd like to talk about the way to do that most appropriately. We want to talk about how to define eligibility. We'd like to hear really to focus on lower income residents, but need to nail down exactly how to judge that, and also to try to make this program as minimally intrusive as far as the paperwork that an applicant or participant needs to put together. We want to make that as minimal as possible to aid participation. To your question a minute ago, Chair Ravel, we have identified geographic priorities in terms of ward and census tract, but as we know, wards and census tracts don't line up with each other perfectly. So we do need to define more precise boundaries and also determine if it's a preference or requirement that participants are in these boundaries. We certainly want to focus in those areas of high need, but if there is a building that is serving that has a large number of affordable units, which seems like an interested participant, is that going to be a preference or requirement is a question we need to answer. We're very concerned and interested in preservation of affordability, particularly in rental properties. So we want to talk about strategies to ensure affordability is maintained, which probably would be in the form of requirements put on landlords as a condition of program participation. But we need to work out exactly what those requirements would be and what the enforcement mechanisms also would be. And we want to talk about contractor engagement and what types of other resources the program can make available that are useful to participants, and other questions like that that may come up. So this is what we want the group to cover. And then if you go to the final slide I've got here, put some thought into membership. And just to emphasize here, this is meant to be a non-voting group. This is not going to be voting on design decisions. It will be advising as we then work with the city to determine the program parameters. So because it's non-voting, the exact numbers are not that important, but we do want a variety of voices who represent different constituencies. So at the top of our list are some community-based organizations who participated in the Partners for Places study, or we think otherwise would be interested. We really like working with community organizations because they can broadly represent the needs of the constituencies they serve and also connect us directly to participants who might want to participate in this program. We think it'd be valuable to have some affordable housing residents themselves. probably recruited through these CBOs. It would also be very valuable to have landlords, in part because we want to set affordability protection requirements that are directed to them. So we'd like their opinions on which of these are the ones that make most sense. And these could be either private or nonprofit, would be of interest in having here. And probably some groups who are sustainable building experts or specialists who have done this kind of work before would also be useful. So one important point, and I phrase this as a question on the bottom, and I think really it's more of a, we think we know the answer, is that anyone who participates on the advisory group is probably not going to be eligible to receive an improvement in their home because we would consider that to be a conflict of interest. So we have to tread carefully here to avoid accidentally disqualifying potential participants.
Right.
So I'm not sure that's completely set in stone yet, but I think the city's initial judgment was we don't want to have somebody who is on the advisory group and gets a retrofit. But again, that's a matter of us making that decision unless there's a firm legal answer to that yet. So that's what we wanted to talk about with you tonight, to really get your input on the proposal that we have in these final 3 slides. So yeah, so let me reintroduce Robbie Marcus here with EDC. Will help with the discussion and help answer some of these questions designing this. And then with that, we'd like to open this up to your questions. And
Great.
I'd like to add something. We've had a little bit of conversation around the question around the advisory group. And I think we're going to try to see and discuss with legal. There might be ways to make sure that we address conflicts of interest and document eligibility so that we don't exclude people that were participating in the advisory group and exclude potential residents or landlords that would want to participate in the program. They're not designing the program per se, they're advising, but we need to run this by legal.
Okay. But it is obviously an important question to get resolved. Lauren, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi, thank you for the presentation. Can I just brain dump a couple of thoughts and questions in no particular order?
Sure.
Okay, so on this question about eligibility, if you participate in the advisory group, honestly, I think regardless of what legal says, I think the optics would be really bad. And I think optics matter. And I think we know that affordable housing and resources for housing is a super controversial and tricky issue in Evanston. So personally, I know that limits who you can get in terms of making sure community voices are represented. But even if someone can talk to a nonprofit and then the nonprofit is actually speaking as the community, I'm pretty strongly against that for what it's worth, though. The second thing is I would be curious to know, I guess these are all questions. One is, you mentioned protecting affordability on rents, but I'm curious to know if you're thinking something similar on home ownership, right? Because the same risk actually exists potentially depending on the type of repairs to those properties. So I'm curious to know if that's also a priority for the homes that are owned and not rented. I'd be curious to know if there are targets for what percentage of the funding is for home ownership versus rental. And if so, kind of like what's the thinking around that? And then my one other question, and this is just a random thought, and I may be totally off the mark, but when you were talking about census tracts versus wards, the other thought I had was that if I recall correctly, there was also a component about this that was about resiliency, right? As climate causes risks in certain areas. I think it would be also interesting to potentially overlay if there are parts of Evanston that are likely to be more at risk in a changing climate. That might be something where there's a little bit of preferential consideration because we could get more bang for our buck, not only doing the repairs and upgrades, but this added level of vulnerability that we're buffering against.
Yep. So all good points. You want me to respond to those before we go on to the next question?
Yeah,
Okay.
please go ahead.
So I'll go in reverse order so I can go up the page here. So yeah, we did map climate vulnerability in the initial study that led to this program, and the recommendations we have geographically are places where we see that overlay of social or housing affordability, vulnerability plus climate affordability. So we do think I can share those maps, or they're in a link that was in a memo, I think, to that full study. But you're totally right. We should be thinking of that, and we think we have. So, so that's a good point. We don't have targets for ownership versus rent, and I would say we're trying to deliberately do a variety of different types of units because it's a pilot. We're not trying to be efficient and do one narrow thing like over and over. We're trying to do a variety of different types of improvements and see what happens. So we don't have a target for that. I think the only answer I would have is we'd like to have both. We'd like to see how it works in owner occupied and rental occupied. But there's not a number that I would say that we have in mind for either one of those. And then for affordability on ownership, I think that's an interesting question. I'm curious what policies you would think would be a way to deal with that. I know that affordability for rent, we think is very important to maintain that because of the ability of landlords to just raise rents. Homeowners don't capture that value until they sell. So unless there was a requirement to repay the value of the improvement, but then that would probably look like a lien on the property, which would make it hard for them to sell in the first place. So I don't know. I'm not sure what the mechanism would be, but that could be, as Sarah's saying, maybe a forgivable loan. That may be hard to convince the low-income people who were trying to get to do this to be involved. So anyway, it's a good question. And maybe we can brainstorm some options and talk about that with the advisory group. But I think that's a very good question. I don't have a quick answer to. But if others have ideas, we could, if this is an appropriate place to get some other thoughts on that, I'd be interested in hearing if others have suggestions on that one.
Well, so thank you, Lauren, for getting us started with some really stuff. So Councilmember Harakaris.
Yeah, so I agree with Lauren about the eligibility to be receive the retrofit if you're on the advisory council. Ideally, I mean, we want to have people who would potentially benefit from this program be sitting on the advisory board. But the nice thing is, since this is a pilot, if everything goes well after the pilot and after we figure out the requirements, someone who sat on the advisory board initially could apply. I imagine we're going to have way more than 50 eligible properties. I was just curious, Bob, do we have like a rough estimate of how many homes or apartment buildings would potentially qualify for this?
We have not tried to put that together. No, we haven't determined eligibility. I mean, I would, off the top of my head, I would say I would guess that maybe 20% of the homes in Evanston would be eligible for this if there was no geographic targeting. Maybe it goes down to 10% if you focus in just these areas. So it's a bunch. There's going to be a lot of places that could do it. So that's completely off the top of my head, a guess more than anything else, but just to put a number out there. Okay, but thanks for your thoughts. And I agree too that we may be able to get interest from people who are not going to be able to participate now, but could in the future. Or also, I agree with Lauren's point about community-based organizations representing the needs of residents in their constituencies, and those individuals wouldn't get benefit, but they could represent the interests of residents who they serve. So that's part of the reason we really like community organizations being part of these types of committees.
This is Sarah. I just wanted to note, I'm going to turn my camera back on. My connection has been bad, so I turned it off so I could hear. One of the reasons that targeting the specific census tracts we talked about as well is since that is in the White House's definition. I mean, if we look at those are defined as areas where we should be investing. It takes away some of the potential questions about, well, how did you decide if everybody was income eligible? 8092 is a qualified census tract, and that was the one they said, you can pretty much do anything you want there and it'll be eligible. And part of 8102, the very eastern part of it, is, if you look at the low and moderate income population, very much lines up with the census block groups in 8092. And 8096 was also on the map that was done by the White House, saying 40% of the money ought to go into these areas that were declared to be high need. It was declared as part of the high need area. So that's another kind of reason to look at those geographic preferences to ultimately, depending on what sources we're using, it's going to affect who would be eligible, because many of the other sources have much more specific income requirements. So that's another. So we're trying to balance getting buildings that we can figure stuff out and keeping the people still eligible.
Yeah, Lauren?
I think my question just got answered, but just to be clear, if you did it by census tract, that's not in lieu of qualifying on income individually, right? You're still going to have income
Right.
requirements. Okay, just making sure. Just making sure.
Yeah.
Is it possible that if thinking about one property owner in the pilot, and you work with the homeowner to, or rent, yeah, or landlord, whatever, to make a significant number of improvements to the home, but maybe not everything. So would there, because I guess I kind of envision some houses it'll be multiple phases before the home is net zero or whatever. I mean, because are you going to try to make the homes net zero from day one, or what?
Yeah, no, I think we found when we were doing this, the study on this, that net zero was too high of a goal to try to hit like immediately, that we could get toward net zero. We certainly could have more energy efficient, more water efficient, and more climate resilient homes and healthier homes. And that became the goal, instead of aiming for a standard of net zero, which for many existing homes would just be very, maybe even physically impossible to achieve that for some of the homes that are occupied now. So yeah, I do think the goal is going to be, and we've talked with Elevate and also with EC about how this will work, is a prioritization process where we go through and do a comprehensive assessment of the home, see what's most important to improve the quality of it now and improve its resilience and its efficiency. And it's probably not going to be a list of every single thing that could be done in a home. It's going to be the ones that align best with the purpose of this program. So there could be improvements on top of that the homeowner wants to take on themselves, or maybe could be left for a later phase. So yeah, the assessment will be comprehensive, but I don't know that we'll be able to do every single thing which is picked up in the assessment. We will do the most important.
Right. Yeah. Lauren?
Okay, I know I'm asking a lot of questions.
Fine, that's
Please,
fine.
everyone, feel free to tell me to stop. Can I just do one more set, Bob, of like brain dump, and then I'll stop? Okay, I'm just listening to what you're saying and it's getting me thinking. So here are some questions I have for you. One, is there going to be baseline level that the house has to be in terms of condition to be eligible? And sort of within that, is there thus going to be a cap on the amount of investment that any single property gets, regardless of home owner occupied versus tenant? Similarly, and I apologize if you all have put this somewhere. I may have not seen it, or yeah. So I apologize if I should know this, but is there an explicit goal that you're trying to get to with the property? So you can say, okay, like listening to you talk, it sounds like you're saying we're going to assess each property and then decide the priorities. That potentially strikes me as a difficult way to go about it, in part because your priorities may not match the property owner's priorities. So in that instance, who wins, right? How do you make that decision? Whereas if you all say, okay, our priorities are to get the properties that we're going to work with to this level of energy efficiency, or this level of, I mean, I know nothing about any of the stuff you all are doing, but this level of like air quality in your homes, or this level of not, whatever these, these are the standards. And so if you have those parameters in place, it seems like it might be a more objective way to qualify properties. So I was just curious if you guys have sort of identified, or all of you, not all guys, if all of you have figured out what those standards are going to be. Because there's a little bit of the chicken or the egg. Do you set up the standards, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, probably I should ask my team member who knows more about construction stuff to talk a little bit here. So Robbie, do you have any thoughts? We have worked with Elevate on like what the targets will be for energy efficiency improvements overall for the program as a whole, for energy efficiency, and also reduction in utility costs. So we do have some quantitative targets that we're going to be trying to achieve for that, but I don't know that we've set that for things like indoor air quality or other measures like that. But Robbie, what do you think? Is that a direction we could try to go here, to have certain standards that we move the units to, or what's your thought?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think I would want to hear Elevate's thoughts on it, because I think as I think about single family versus multifamily, with rehab, every unit is different. It's all so dependent. And so it's hard to predict what the baseline is and what you're starting with. And so that makes it difficult to assess where do you want to go, because it's just going to depend on the unit. And so I think you bring up a great question, and I think we'll want to take it back to our partner at Elevate to hear through their thoughts on how do they think about where they want each unit to be by the end of the program. And Bob's right that in terms of energy efficiency savings and cost savings, that is a clear goal. But beyond that, I think perhaps that's one for us to think about further.
And maybe to your point earlier, Bob, because it's a pilot, that's a question you'll get answered, that it turns out it's like, to me, it sounds extremely inefficient to not have some standards, just in terms of for you all, right, to operate from. But I could be totally wrong about that, or that you want some sort of cap. I don't know, right? The individual assessment sounds to me like a difficult way to approach it, but I could be totally wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, no, these are good questions. And you're right. I mean, the fact that this is a pilot means that we are going to be experimenting with some things like this, which I think is one of the values of doing this with a relatively small investment up front, and see how this goes. And then maybe it becomes a larger program. But to your question about, is there a baseline level of condition, we haven't really established that there needs to be. I mean, if what the home needs is a new roof, and there's no point in doing anything else with energy efficiency until it has a new roof, we can use this program to pay for a new roof for this homeowner. That's one of the good things about having it be not just for certain delimited types of improvements. We can actually look comprehensively at what is the real challenge in this home and then fix that thing. In terms of cost, we had said that most improvements that we're paying for with this, I think the range we said for most things would be between $5,000 and $35,000 per unit, but for some it could be more than that. So there could be some homes that need a larger investment of that to even make other investments possible or worthwhile, in which case it'd be a higher amount there. So, but yeah. Did you want to add something, Sarah? I'm sorry, I saw you unmuted a second ago.
I was just thinking about air quality and things like that. One of the things that's really hard to control too, because if you start with a building, the air quality is going to be dependent on so many factors, including, I know from my own lack of willingness to dust, what the homeowner does. So, I think that some of those, and I do want to also point out that one of our huge problems, and we've had trouble with how to solve it when we're working with CDBG and some other things, is when we have homes that have foundations that almost no matter what, we are not able to make them really waterproof based on the nature of the foundations and their age and things like that. So and this is maybe something we can talk with our health department about too, because, this really ties into the making housing healthier overall, and they may be able to give us some priorities or ways to think about that I think would be helpful. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Joanne, we haven't heard from you.
Yeah, well, I just imagine you would look at safety issues too. If there are any leaking furnace or, things like that, but anything in the house that would relate to making it safer for the occupants.
Yes, you definitely want to look at safety and code compliance while you are doing those initial assessments.
Any code violation, a major code violation, that's a life safety thing we would have to correct in any project we do. That's
Okay, Lauren, again, back to you.
Now this is it, but maybe if you all need a volunteer in your advisory, I feel like this is interesting. So if you want, maybe we could connect.
I mean, how about
I don't know.
A liaison from this committee could be on the advisory board.
Yeah, that'd be great, actually.
Yeah.
Whether or not you want that person to be me might be a different question.
I think, Lauren, you're shaping up to be the right person for this.
Well, so I have, and then I'm done, I promise. So one, though, to Sarah's point, what happens if someone applies and you all become aware of a situation that by law you would be, the code has to be addressed to come into code, right? Like, how does that work? Like, is there situations where you're just gonna, by necessity, have to address something? I would be curious. And then the very last thing I'm gonna say, and then I'll stop, is if there's any requirement for skin in the game, even of like $50 towards it, like, I'm just thinking about the huge variation in the size of the repairs and all the research that shows sort of the buy-in that comes with just a minimal skin in the game. And I know that's delicate, but that is still usually, an option.
Yeah.
That's it. Now I'm done. I
Yeah.
promise for now.
Well, I think, Bob, you've got your first advisory group member here.
Yeah, I would welcome you. These are all the kind of questions we actually have to answer. And so I appreciate that you're bringing them up. This is good. So to your first one, I think Sarah had spoken to that if we find a code compliance item, that there's a mandate to deal with that. And I would let the city speak to that more. I don't want to get into the code enforcement piece here, but to the second one, I think that's also a good question. Everything you're raising here is a good design question about, we want to have residents feel ownership. We also don't want to prevent the lowest income residents from participating, or just add a level of complexity where if they're paying anything, does that just make it more complicated to get the project done, to get the transaction done? And maybe it would, but I think there's also merit to what you're saying. There needs to be some level of payment shows ownership. So I think there is pros and cons there, and we should discuss that more in an advisory group. So I encourage you to bring that question when we have our first meeting.
So, Bob, do you have enough input from this group?
I would like to hear if anyone has other people they would suggest to be on the advisory group. We're going to work with city staff on this, but if others can say, like, I definitely want this community organization or this nonprofit to be present, you should talk to this or that person. You either could say that now, or you could send that to Marion or Sarah or any of the city staff, and they'll get that to us for us to know. So,
yeah. Does anybody have any thoughts at the moment, or just happy to mull it over and communicate later? I think this has been a really productive discussion. It's really helped us get a sense of the pilot program and also the role of the advisory group and the kinds of issues that the groups still that have to be answered before the pilot really gets much further along. So it's been really an interesting conversation.
I agree. I'm glad we got a quorum.
Yeah, right, exactly, right. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and we will continue to be in touch.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you. All right, so let's turn to our official agenda, and we'll go back to the obligatory things that we do at the very beginning of all of our meetings, which is if someone would move to suspend the rules to allow us to meet virtually.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you. And a second?
Second.
Okay, and then I guess we need a roll call on that.
Sure. Councilmember Ravel.
Yes, I. I.
Councilmember Heracadis.
Aye.
Councilmember Burns. Joanne Salome.
Aye.
Lauren Berlin.
Yes, aye.
And Councilmember Burns.
Well, it's a majority.
Okay.
Okay. And then we need a motion to approve the minutes of our September 20th meeting. Could I have a motion on that?
So moved.
And a second?
A second.
Okay, thanks. And a roll call?
Chair Ravel.
Aye.
Councilmember Heracadis.
Aye.
Joanne Salome.
Aye.
Lauren Berlin,
Aye.
Councilmember Burns,
Um,
majority.
We'll consider those approved.
Okay.
Okay, so we've finished our public comment and we finished our first item about the one-stop shop. And now we're supposed to be discussing shift in needs and priorities for 2023. But
Yes, so I have one slide and I wanted to open the conversation, but I'd like to ask you, Chair Ravel, if we're okay to have this conversation or if you're looking to postpone it. This conversation was trying to discuss priority and needs with the committee in preparation for the action plan process. Next month we'll be coming with a draft action plan that will be discussed in December by the committee. And we were hoping to get some kind of input to make sure that we can understand where the committee is at for 2023. But I just want to double check with you if that's still something that we can do tonight.
well, why don't we let's do the rest of the agenda and see if we have time at the end. And also, I think it'd be helpful if we had a little something to mull over before we have that discussion. So anyway, so let's move on then to the next item, which is very important item on our agenda, which is our small and medium landlord assistance program. And so I guess officially, Robert's rules say we're supposed to make a motion and then we can discuss it. So if someone would make a motion that the committee recommend approval of the small and medium landlord assistance program, that we can get started.
I move to discuss and vote to recommend the small and medium landlord assistance program.
Okay, thank you. And is there a second?
I second.
Okay, great. So we had some material in our packet, but is there additional?
Yeah, we did. So there is the memo, of course. We did a couple slides. There's a lot in that memo. So we figured having a few slides to kind of help us through the conversation probably would be a little helpful.
Right.
And we want to add some context to the conversation that we've had with both internally as well as with the task force around the design of this program. It sounds easy and it's a pretty complex process when it comes time to actually design and implement and make sure that you balance easy program with a lower barrier for application and making sure that it's equitable, as well as balancing kind of having some level of restriction without being complicated. So plus the restriction of the fundings that the funding sources we're dealing with. So I'm going to let Anna describe where we're starting from as far as the program design that was described in your packet. And then I'm going to go through a few slides that explain all the different intricacies that we looked at to start the conversation.
All right, so good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to thank all of the landlords who submitted responses to the residential landlord evaluation survey. We reached out to approximately 3,000 landlords and we received 50 responses back. The response rate was low, but that's pretty typical for landlord surveys that have been done on the national level. So I think we're right there as far as response rate. As far as the program design goes, we want the program, or we would like the program to be open to Evanston small and medium landlords. And this is 1 to 35 units combined between all properties. This was done through research of what a small landlord is based on census data. And this research was done in the beginning of our task force meetings. As far as financial assistance, we would like to cover up to 75% of 2021 rental financial losses and up to 12,000 or 15,000 as an up to amount threshold. And we will leave that decision up to the committee. Of course, units must be registered with the city and be legally rented, and business income should be reported. So those are three big requirements. And I'll turn it over to Marianne so she can kind of go into the intricacies that we've encountered with the data and with the funding requirements that we have to abide by.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. So the program that we are proposing in the memo and in your packet was what we landed on, trying to take into account some of the restriction of the funding that we're source we're dealing with, which is ARPA funding. Making sure we address putting together a program that is for the initial goal, which was to provide assistance to small and medium landlords, and trying to take into account the result we got in the survey, as well as making sure that we don't land with the program design that provides such restriction that the application is just a pile of red tape and we have incredibly low applications. So that's why we landed on trying to simplify as much as possible the program design. I'm going to go through other consideration. I do want to point out that the question around the threshold of $12,000 to $15,000, that's something that came up in a task force. And so we decided to put it to the committee. Having a threshold amount of up to $12,000, essentially, the argument for that was it's a lower amount. That means that there will be more landlords able to apply for the program. The threshold of $15,000 was suggested to take into account the fact that we had landlords that had much deeper losses and to make sure that we were providing meaningful assistance to those landlords. I think it's worth noting that we didn't see necessarily a relationship between the number of units and the actual scale of the financial loss that a landlord had seen. Some of the higher losses were seen by people that had very limited number of units. So I'll just start with that, and then we'll go into the more complicated details of the program design. So one of the key points that we'd like to discuss tonight is what we use to be able to set eligibility. In your packet, we talked about using 2021 reported financial loss. So that would essentially mean that we're looking at, in an example of an LLC, a Schedule E, and looking at line 21, which is there's income reported, there's all the expenses, and we're looking at seeing an actual loss for 2021. Now, going that route allowed us to request only one piece of paperwork, which is that one Schedule E for 2021. We know that requesting a lot of burdensome paperwork and personal information, whether it's business or personal, is going to lower applications. So we wanted to try to keep it as simple as possible. However, there's things that we'd like the committee to take into consideration. In the case of using just 2021, which has been mentioned also in the public comment, what we're essentially excluding is any landlord that have seen a loss in their income, but are not reporting an actual loss. So I'm putting some examples on the slide here. You could essentially have a landlord that has a property that has had a small financial loss with the impact of depreciation, various business expense, mortgage interest deduction, that saw a small loss, and that person could be eligible. But you could see a small landlord that is using their rental property as true income as a business that has seen deep financial loss, but is still seeing instead of a regular usual year, a small gain. And in that case, using just the reported loss, that landlord would be ineligible, even though they've seen a pretty major gain in their income. So that's something to consider in the program design. We could consider to use a delta of between 2019 and 2021, as was also suggested by one of the comment that was provided as a written comment. The downside of that is you're requesting an additional tax return during the application. So it's yet another piece of paperwork that we're asking for. So that's one thing to consider. Going a little deeper here into the nuance of the program design, because it's really that point in the program design is one of the most important one. There's several things we can look at. We can use 2021 reported financial loss as described in the memo and as suggested by the program. We can use the delta of 2019 to 2021 total result, which would mean the difference in the result between those 2 years. And it could be still a gain, but there'd be a loss in between the 2 years. So that would, in the previous scenario, that would mean both applicants would be eligible. Or we could simply look at the delta in reported rent income, excluding any kind of expenses and just keeping it at just rent income differences. And in that case, it removes some of the question around whether we want to include depreciation and the impact of depreciation on total loss in a Schedule E. But that starts to be quite burdensome again, because we're asking for 2 different tax returns to make a comparison. I understand this is a lot of detail. We just wanted to bring some of those up because this is really kind of crucial as far as who's going to be eligible and who's not going to be eligible. Other things we've considered, we landed with just looking at a certain percentage of financial loss after considering a whole different slew of other options, looking at number of units, looking at setting a certain threshold on rents or affordability, looking at potentially restricting on the landlord income or the tenant income or specific areas. So I'm going to go over a few of those points. Essentially, some of those restrictions can sometimes be considered, but we have to be very, very mindful of the level of burden it's going to take for the application to make someone eligible. So as an example, if we're looking at restricting to reasonably priced rentals, when you look at an application, then we have to be able to check. So that means that essentially we would have to gather leases to be able to prove what rent each unit is at, gather all that information, and then we'd also maybe have to check each unit size to be able to match it against the reasonably priced rents, since they're usually set by size of unit. So that gets quite complex, and we're not even 100% sure that the unit size is something we can check systematically based on the data we have. Restricting landlord income, that's something we discussed as well within the task force. That takes into account having to look at personal tax returns, which creates an even higher burden, because now we're not looking just at asking for a business return Schedule E, we're looking at getting an entire person's personal information tax return. But it also creates major complication when we start talking about more complex setup for landlords. I think a lot of us, when we think about the landlord setup and small landlord, assume that it's one or a few LLCs with one owner and one or a couple Schedule Es. It's likely, and we are currently working with legal on trying to understand what how the implementation of the program is going to impact a more complex scenario. But we're going to run into more complex scenario. We're going to have people that have shared ownership, that have multiple properties with multiple owners. Then what kind of personal tax return do we ask for? Who is eligible, who's not? Do every owner have to be eligible? There's just a level of complexity that starts to really impact the success of the program. Prioritizing highly impacted areas, that's something we could look at. We've done this for rental assistance and housing assistance. When we implemented rental assistance early on during the COVID crisis, we did several phases of application. And we did use data from the Urban Institute showing which area and which census tract were highly impacted by COVID. And that included also potential job loss. So we could consider 2 phases to try to set aside a first wave of application for highly impacted areas and then open it up to broader areas in the city. But that would delay getting the funds out because you'd have 2 waves and it would postpone the process. It would also add to the processing time, but that is something that is feasible. So I'm going to stop here, and I am sure there's a lot to discuss here. So we can probably open it up to the committee.
And I just wanted to add, we really worked hard on looking at this project through an equitable lens and making sure that we were also producing an efficient program while also maximizing the fund. So we are aware that this is a complex project, and we would appreciate any and all input from the committee.
Okay. Lauren, go for it.
Sorry. Okay. Might not surprise you. I had some thoughts on this.
Yes.
On the question of gauging the loss, personally, I think that it is not inappropriate to ask for that second set of returns and do the slightly more complicated calculation, because I think that's more important than some of the other areas we could ask for documentation. I think that this money should go to people who have suffered, who are in the negative on income as a result of what's happened, right? They are in the red on these rents. So that's just my and I think for the amount of money we're talking about, I don't think that's unreasonable to ask for 2 sets of returns instead of 1. So on that question, that's my own thought, if I understood it correctly.
The 2 personal returns.
Yeah. The 2019, right? On the slide that was like, do we ask for 2019 as well?
The 2 Schedule E's.
Yes, the 2
which would be
Schedule
for the
E.
business and not for the personal.
Not personal, yes.
And I just want to clarify one thing you just said. You are suggesting looking at the loss in income specifically. So because there was 2 options. We can look at the loss in rent perceived, or we can look at the total including expenses, which could include increased expenses from COVID or any other impact that's increased as a result of COVID. So that's one nuance I just want to clarify.
Okay, that is an important nuance. Can I tell you my just like not specific answers, but what I think the overarching way to approach this would be, the philosophy? I think losing money is hard, and we need these houses, these units, right? So I think that if there's a demonstrable loss, to the extent that we can, we cover it with these, we make this money available, but we have basically like opportunities for more in certain instances. So instead of limiting it to areas that are highly impacted, if we have the funding, maybe it's more like, if you're in these areas, you could go up to 18,000, for example, as opposed to 12,000 or 15. Or for each one of your units that's serving a Section 8 voucher or a documented LMI, population of whatever income area we're targeting, like you can get an additional support of X amount. Like, I think rather than keep potentially lower the floor, I think we keep the floor wherever we're going to keep it. And then we could layer on support for these areas that are really serving pockets of the community that's harder to reach. I don't know if we have the funding for that. Does that make sense? I'm not as concerned about the ownership structure piece and all that. There's a lot of people raising hands, so I'll stop. But that's my fundamental. If I could approach it that way, I would like to.
Joanne?
Well, I want to say, if you had a Section 8 tenant during COVID, you were still getting paid from Section 8. I mean, this is really complicated when you see that all that you have to take into consideration. You know, unless, I mean, I had a Section 8 tenant who wasn't paying his share, you know, but otherwise, you know, if Section 8 was the majority of the rent, then you were still getting that rent. But I guess I would sort of lean towards going to the areas that were most highly impacted. And then, you know, my other conflict is I would, what a person's total income is. I guess I would want to lean towards landlords where their rent was a sizable part of their total income, but then we have to ask for the personal part of the return. So there's some conflicts I sort of have, you know, of how to determine eligibility. Yay, not easy. And then with multiple owners, geez.
Yeah.
You're grasping quite a bit of the conversation that we've had. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, my head is sort of spinning here.
Councilmember Harakanis.
Yeah, I agree with Lauren on having to provide the two tax returns. You know, 1 year might be hard, you know, hard to parse whether or not there was an impact if you just are looking at 1 year's worth of data. I get the you know, my mind goes to like having like a rubric to decide like who gets what money and how much, but I do like really appreciate like the idea of having like a low bar for entry. But maybe we could have you folks thought of having like kind of like what Lauren said, the minimum standard, but you know, if you provide more documentation for different categories, maybe being prioritized and or getting a slightly larger amount based on providing that information. Because if you did have a huge financial impact and you were serving like an underserved community, I think you don't want to make it too complicated, but producing like a few documents to get a few extra grand might be worth would probably be worth the effort if you were really in that affected group.
We haven't considered having two different thresholds, but that's something we could consider. I will say doing it on a census tract could be manageable from an administrative point of view. We'd really have to think hard about including the affordability of the unit, because that is extremely complex to check. That's one of the first things we tried to look at. It sounds easy in concept, but it can get pretty complicated to be able to check. So that's something we could consider, but we'd have to get latest leases. We'd have to be able to double check unit size. It's fairly easy to do on considering a low level of units for one applicant. If we start dealing with somebody that has 30 units with 30 leases, that starts being a little complex. I'm not discounting it, but we'd have to really think through that. If the committee is really feeling strongly about that.
So, you know, I'm the new member here, so I apologize if this has been discussed before, but the licensing or the registration aspect of this, like what is there easily accessible data there? Like,
there is easily accessible data in the sense that we can potentially check the unit number. I am not, the data on that side is pretty rough. It is a project of the city and the community development department to improve that, but it is quite lacking in its current setup. I am not convinced that we would be able to check unit sizes, number of bedrooms. And when we talk about affordability, if outside of considering Section 8 and vouchers, we'd probably need unit sizes. And that's where it starts getting complex.
I mean, so I'm come from an IT background, so that might be something that, like, as we think of like modernizing or changing, you know, our back end systems, having like a, you know, a SQL, have it somehow in like a searchable database. I mean, there's a lot of things you can learn.
Yeah, there's
And so,
absolutely.
but it does
Yes.
need time and like, and you know,
That is
Yes,
absolutely on our
ways to
radar.
have time to do that. Yeah.
yeah, just so you know, Councilmember Hedekaris, we tried to scrub through the data as best that we could. But there are contradicting fields. And then data migration was not done correctly. So a lot of the information is obsolete or missing. So we have been working through this data in Excel, basically. So we've been cleaning through it, removing duplicates, and that's the best that we can get as far as now. But I do agree with you that we definitely need some form of database that can track not only number of units, but unit sizes and affordability. So that's extremely important.
Yeah, because it's probably something that going forward we can use on like a lot of different projects. I haven't had a chance to go through the open, what's it called, the open data portion of the website, but all that stuff would be pretty interesting. Thanks.
Upgrading our database is a major requirement for improving our property standards program, and that's really being looked at there. I don't know that we will ever really be able to track the rents of all units. That is a massive, massive job. But we absolutely need to have the number of units, the sizes of units, and things like that. And ideally, we would be able to have some way of taking any that has any kind of income restriction that is in place too, so that we have that kind of those data. A huge challenge, but it has to be done. Our database is terrible.
Any more thoughts? Juan? No. So what kind of information did we get from the landlords when they filled out a survey? Did they tell us the impact on me was I had a tenant who didn't pay rent for 6 months, or was that the main source of the problem for our landlords?
So the survey was set up in a way where all questions were optional to ensure that we had as much results as we could. And the question essentially asked how many units they had, how many of those were in Evanston, and how many of the ones in Evanston had been impacted by vacancy or rent delinquencies. Mm-hmm. So that was one factor. And then we also asked what was their rough gross revenue for 2019, 2020, 2021, mm-hmm. and expenses for 2019, 2020, 2021 to try to be able to assess some kind of trend. Of course, not everybody answered those questions. Mm-hmm. We had a variety of scenarios. There was a good chunk of people that reported having little impact, but there was quite a bit that did report having an impact. And it was really interesting to see how the data was very varied. One thing that didn't change, and we got a lot of responses that were small landlords. I believe it was 96% that were 1 to 3 units, some of the responses. But the stories that were put in the comment or through the numbers were very different. We had people that mentioned, oh, we had an impact, but we got rent assistance, so we were made whole. We had an impact, and on one unit, we had rent assistance, but on the other one, we had a really long vacancy. And so we got a really deep loss there. there's some people that had a massive drop in income, some people that had a medium-sized drop, but then they had expenses that kind of skyrocketed. So there was a lot of different scenarios that made it fairly complicated because we had a small amount of data, very small, although not surprising, and a lot of different scenarios with that data.
Okay, because I was thinking if the biggest problem was the fact that tenants weren't paying their rent, then if we could just look at just, the drop in income that the landlords receive, that would be a way to gauge the need, but I guess it sounds more complicated than that.
It doesn't. This is really kind of a consideration that the committee can discuss, whether we're looking at line 3 on the Schedule E, which is the rent perceived, or line 21, which is the total result. It changes the nature of the program and what you're including in the loss. But the complexity for us isn't really much higher. Items that create a lot of complexity in paperwork on both parties is more around looking at personal incomes, unit size, price of the unit, things like that. But if the committee is looking to make a decision on income versus total result, that there's not really a lot of impact. It's just a design issue of whether you want to include the potential for people that had increased expenses, knowing that by doing that, you're also including all expenses.
Joanne?
I just wondered how you came up with 35 units, that number, that seemed a little high.
Yes, we looked at census data nationwide to see how many units per small landlord each small landlord had. So the data threw back that from 1 to 15 is what is considered a small landlord, and then from 15 to 30, 35 is the medium sized landlord. So that's from the census data, and that's linked in the memo.
I just wanted to bring something up. It might not be a good thought, but there may be significant differences in cost factors, like increases in costs because of COVID, if you have more units in a single building. For example, if you have a 6-unit building and everybody's using the same stairwells and all that stuff, there was this whole protocol where people were supposed to go wipe down the common areas and things like that. If you have a 2-flat and they each have totally separate entrances, you don't have some of those same things. I wonder if there's any, I hadn't thought of this before, so Marion and Anna may want to kill me. If we considered looking at the different needs, or if it would help, if they think there's any difference between how it might affect a larger landlord. And of course, total number of units wouldn't necessarily be it either. There might be size of buildings, so that might be something that's just completely impossible to roll in. But I mean, that's one of the challenges of this. There are so many factors. How to weigh them and how to control for them is really challenging.
It's not something we had necessarily considered, but it's definitely an interesting point when it comes to deciding whether we're looking at total result versus just income, because we are aware there's some expenses that have increased for landlords during COVID, and that was kind of one of the consideration, looking at the actual financial result versus just the income loss.
Mm-hmm.
And going off of what Joanne said, we also do have to take into consideration the business structure, because while there are some landlords that are sole proprietors, some of them are LLCs or holdings or family trusts. So we have to take that into consideration also.
In what way?
We are seeking help from our legal team to make sure that we're gathering the right wording to make sure that we take into account multiple owners of one building or different trustees for one trust and so. So this will not apply for like simple cases where there's one landlord per one building with multiple units, but it will come into account when we look at different business structure setups.
Yeah, Lauren?
Oh, this is not easy. Mm.
No, it's not easy at all. And I,
The longer we talk,
at
the more
all.
complicated it gets.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, in trying to make some of these decisions, at the risk of stating the obvious, I mean, perhaps you all have been doing this all along, but maybe it's helpful to return to what the intentions are of the program. Like, are the intentions to help as many units to stay in the hands of mom and pop, like to help as many landlords? Is the intentions to help as many landlords with serving low-income populations or in certain geographies? Like, because I'm not actually clear on that level of detail of the goal beyond wanting to help small and medium-sized landlords. So maybe some clarity around the program's intentions would help us to.
Sure. The intention for the program was to put together an assistance program for small and medium landlords that have been affected to prevent the loss of naturally occurring affordable housing, or to prevent the consolidation of rental housing into the hands of larger landlords, which have been shown to provide more restrictive rental conditions for our residents.
So at the risk of sounding cold-hearted, and I mean, I work with all of my population, so my personal opinion, I wouldn't necessarily support this, but if that's genuinely the goal, then I don't actually think it's relevant whether they're in areas of high need, whether there's affordable. Like, if what we're really saying, hand to heart, is that we just want these landlords to be able to hold on to these properties, then we just want to get the money out to landlords who own, it sounds like, up to 35 properties in Evanston and who have experienced a financial loss. Like, all this question of layering and these other things, like, I'm not trying to be a jerk. I absolutely personally believe that we should be prioritizing some of these things and not some of these other things. But in terms of getting the money out of the door, which it sounds like is also important, there may be a case to be made for making a simple program that's eligible to landlords who have experienced losses. And, we get the basic documentation. And I agree with Joanne that I was a little surprised that 35 that we were going that high. I don't know if Joanne said that, but I thought that was the implication with that question.
Yeah.
I was also surprised. I think of small as a little smaller, but if that's honestly our goal with this project, then we need to just get the money out the door to landlords who have lost money and own these units that we want to keep in their hands.
And so, Lauren, are you saying, so it doesn't matter whether the landlord is actually providing a more modest rental property? It could be if the landlord has a really posh apartment and is renting it but had a loss, that person would be eligible? Or do we want to go back to looking at our census tracts, for example?
Well, I think the point that Joanne made, that if the landlord is actually relying on this income, like they need, right, to continue to own this, like we are seeing a loss of their income as a result of this. I don't know. I just think this program is so complicated that if we don't choose to let go of some things, it's going to be paralysis by analysis.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so the things that sounds like are not actually built into this program in terms of its stated goal is making sure they're serving people with low incomes, making sure they're serving people in census tracts of a certain certain locations. It just doesn't sound like that's actually built into it in terms of its stated objective. I would be absolutely for making sure that they're
Right.
serving low incomes or they're affordable, but
Yeah.
it sounds like we're never gonna get the money out the door if we need to get,
Right, well,
figure that out.
but if we simplified it for number one by saying it would be these
Census
three
tracts.
census tracts,
Yeah.
that is not 100% guarantee that that all the landlords are gonna meet this idea that we have, but it would probably get us pretty close to that.
So maybe we do something like that, kind of sort of, what is the instead, let's not let perfect be the enemy of good.
Right.
What is a simple data cut we can make within our control that at least gets us in the ballpark of this shared desire we all have to make sure it's for affordable housing, right? And not posh housing or whatever else, right? So to me, and that it may be that census tract is the way to do that. Because there's another risk, which is how do we know we're not giving money to really crappy landlords, right? Like, so we have risks on all sides of this thing as I see it, which is why at some point I think we pick, but let's let our tech person who probably knows more about the data than me, how to think about data. That's just what I'm hearing. I just think the more we dig in, the more we risk paralysis by analysis, So, yeah.
One thing we could do that wouldn't be just census tracts is we could literally look at the census block groups that are, according to the latest HUD map, low and moderate income. I mean, that would just broaden it a little more than using just census tracts.
I mean, I would guess there's a high correlation, but honestly, between people whose units are to low mod people and landlords who can show a demonstrated loss of income, right? Because we know that the highest job loss is in low mod populations.
Exactly.
And so we're more likely to see rent challenges in landlords having. So I think we have some natural occurring. Anyways, I was going to stop so that Juan could say something. Sorry, Juan.
Go ahead, Juan.
I was just curious if we had like a ballpark figure as to how many potential landlords are eligible for this. Because that can also, color how we're trying to figure out the cutoff. Like Lauren said, maybe because there is a possibility, like you can get in the weeds with trying to figure out the perfect way to do this, but if there's only so many landlords that are eligible, we have to figure anything out.
So that's a very hard number to come by, especially because without a final program design, it's hard to tell what we can, even getting the actual number of landlords in Evanston is not easy because data is by property, not by owner. We ballpark that there's potentially 3,000 to 3,500 landlords in Evanston. And depending on how we design the program, based on the survey information we've seen, there could be 10 to 20% that could be eligible without taking into account geographic restrictions. And then considerations such as, are we looking at losses versus income? Are we looking at delta versus 1 year, things like that. So yeah, if you're just looking specifically at landlord that may have seen a loss in their usual financial results, I'm going to foresee 10 to 20% of that 3,000. But there's a lot of additional criteria in the mix.
It would be nice if we had some easy way to establish people who really a significant part of their income comes from the rental properties, because, I mean, the idea of somebody, we know there are a lot of people who may own a property and they move for a job in another place and they rent out the property, or, but they are making a very good income. always a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a very challenging conversation that we had on that topic. I will say that when it comes to the geographic area, there's two concepts that was brought up. One was upping the threshold depending on the area, and the other was opening eligibility to a certain area and then broadening later if there's any funds remaining. So there's two different approaches that you can consider.
Do you want to say those two again?
Sure. So the first one that was mentioned was having one threshold and then an elevated threshold, such as $18,000 or something that for highly impacted areas or low mod income areas. And then the second one, and that would essentially address getting more money in the areas that are more likely to have more affordable housing. And the second one would be to do 2 waves of application and prioritizing certain areas first, and then if funds are remaining, then opening it up later to other areas.
Okay, yeah. Joanne, go ahead.
Yeah, even though the definition of medium-sized landlord is 35 units, we could decide to lower the number, like to 25. I mean, I suppose, I have no idea. I've never, 2 units, but whether somebody with 35 units, would probably have more people who maybe weren't paying, but I just wonder overall, whether their overall income was impacted as much as somebody with just a lot fewer units.
Yeah, if you only have 3 tenants and one isn't paying rent, that's a bigger hit than 20. Yeah.
I wasn't envisioning that high eligibility.
Yeah, I had the same thought of lowering the total number of units, Joanne.
I think the threshold is also a component to keep in mind in that sense, because once you start taking into account the threshold with the high number of units, it's a very small amount of assistance per unit. So kind of, it does have an impact. It's very hard to answer just because on the survey, 90%, like a very high number of the data that we've seen, that was data that we could actually, like that was localized with actual expense and income reported. I think we only had a couple buildings that were above 20 units. So it's hard to answer. But part of the setting of the threshold was understanding that we didn't want to necessarily favor one or the other. There could be high impact in a building that is maybe in a location and at a affordability level where a lot of the renters were impacted by COVID and therefore have seen a high number of losses. So we didn't necessarily want to exclude that. But
Yeah, so 3 of the 50 were more than 30. 3 of the 50 responses.
Yeah. Lauren?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I've been thinking about is I feel like these people who spoke at the beginning, and I don't remember their names, I apologize if they're still on, but the feedback we were getting from that is that this wasn't enough money. And I would be curious to hear people who worked on the survey, kind of your thoughts on if we're giving enough money. I know money is finite, but that is a question I've been thinking about. And then the other thing I've been wondering is if there are other levers that are available to pull to provide some relief, if not through this program. And maybe that's not a conversation for tonight. This program is complicated enough, but something maybe we should talk about later, because I do feel like that's come through pretty strongly when we've had commenters just throughout our meetings, is that it's tough being a landlord in Evanston right now.
Right,
A small landlord, and it doesn't sound like the size of the amount of relief we're talking about trying to offer is going to be adequate, right?
Right, yeah. No, I think having a longer term discussion about other kinds of ways we can support our small landlords, and particularly the ones that are providing, rent to low and moderate income tenants. So this is just one program, and then I think maybe we should continue the discussion about what other kinds of supports we can provide.
Yeah.
The other thing that we could consider is taking a certain amount of money and designating it as a sort of pilot to see what happens and then make adjustments. I don't necessarily know what we would learn or if it would just make it more complicated again. That's one of the challenges. The minute you think about, well, what if we learn that there's nothing earth-shaking that allows us to do something
Yeah.
and we've just delayed helping people or made a two-step?
Yeah, well, I
thing,
think urgency it's clear there's a sense of urgency
I
on
agree.
the part of landlords. And I do think we should figure out how to get the money out the door.
When it comes to the comment you made before about the level of help and the size of the number of units or that are owned by a landlord, we had consideration around that, around trying to think about whether the program should be designed based on the percentage of impacted unit within a portfolio, or a flat fee per unit. And then we went back to kind of the issue of how to track number of units and implementation. The threshold was put in place so that we looked at the average loss that was reported for those people that were willing to report some information. And we try to make sure that we went well above that. So right now at $15,000, you're looking at a $27 loss of income. It's not a ton, but by trying to establish a program that didn't have too much complexity and wasn't necessarily favoring one or the other, the small landlord versus the very large landlord that could essentially suck up a large percentage of the funds, we had to try to find a balance. So that's kind of how the threshold was put together.
I just wanted to read out of the memo. Average loss per landlord was 6,900, basically, or
that.
7. The max
It just
was
seems a
22.
lot different. I mean, I did read the memo in advance,
Yeah.
but that's very different than what we heard
Right.
at the beginning of this meeting.
Mhm.
Right. So it had caught my attention.
Right. And we were working with the data.
No doubt. No
from it,
doubt.
So
I don't doubt that for a second. Totally get it.
Okay.
Now, I have another question. This is not gonna be per unit, like up to $15,000
it's
per
per
unit.
owner.
It's just
Per
per
land.
owner, okay.
Right.
Well, I guess, I think I would want to emphasize those landlords providing housing for, low and moderate incomes, I suppose, no matter where they were in the city. Anyway, like I said, there's never enough money, and so this is just making my head spin as to which way to go.
Okay, Councilmember Burns.
Yeah, I may have some comments, but if we could, because we had a pretty lengthy discussion, can staff kind of recap where they think we are now, where we landed, and then I may have some comments after hearing that.
Sure. So it sounds like we're looking at the financial assistance, 75% of the delta between 2019 and 2021, either in rent income perceived or in total result for those years. And that we're discussing the threshold. A few numbers have been thrown around, but right now I've heard we proposed $12,000, $15,000, and $18,000 was mentioned as well. And the consideration for a layer that would consider highly impacted areas, which could be either highly impacted census tracts or low moderate income areas as highlighted by the map that we have from census data. I believe that's where we're at.
Yeah. So Councilmember Burns, you want to weigh in with a thought?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think the low to mod areas could address my concern, I think fundamentally for me, and I'm just repeating probably what what other people have said, but obviously anybody that whose income is largely represented by you know, the rental property that they have is a key group. And then you know, landlords who are providing affordable housing, and that doesn't you may be you may rent out at closer to market rate housing in a low to mod area, right? So that's where I get concerned. I mean, I want to make sure we're getting money to those two groups, and if they check both boxes, for me, even better, right? If you rent out to at affordable amounts, affordable rates, affordable prices, and you know, the rental income makes up a large percentage of your income. To me, that's the group that I want to, and you've experienced losses, let's say that. So those three boxes, that's the folks that I'm, you know, would like to see a benefit from this program, at least initially. But again, I think somebody asked earlier, like, what was the original intent? That was my understanding from the beginning, but I could be off. Maybe it was just to support any landlord across the city that you know, whose income is made up largely by rental income, to support them. But I felt like naturally occurring affordable housing was something that I heard brought up every single time we had this discussion. So I don't want to get too far away from that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. So
I guess the question is, do we take naturally occurring affordable housing to be, does it have to be accounted for in some kind of program? So do they have to be receiving, do they have to provide Section 8 or be receiving some sort of aid, housing aid? So I guess my point is, does it have to be documented that they're providing affordable housing, or do we just take naturally occurring affordable housing to be just that, naturally occurring, and any landlord could potentially apply?
Joanne made a really good point that people who had Section 8 or other subsidized tenants were actually more likely to get their rent. They might have struggled with the timing of if the tenants, this happens a lot, the tenant wouldn't be able to pay their portion, and then they had to go back to the housing authority or whoever, and they were supposed to adjust the subsidy based on that, though I'm sure there was a time delay and things like that, and that can be a challenge. So that is a real challenge of trying to define it by any. And I think Lauren also made a good point that to a certain extent, the smaller landlords are known overall, and you can't get it to every landlord to rent at lower rent rates, and often are much more accepting of lower income tenants because they don't have the same challenge, they don't have the same sort of rigid tenant selection plans, and
I would suggest that when we're looking at naturally affordable housing, naturally occurring, that we try to look at, even if it's very imperfect, geographic areas. I just we haven't been able to identify a way to systematically check and implement a program that would really take that into account in a meaningful way. So that probably would be the least imperfect way to look at it.
Right. Yeah. Lauren, do you have another thought?
Well, yeah, so it sounds to me like we're really interested in 3 criteria. It sounds like we are interested in landlords for whom a large portion of their income comes from their rents. We are interested in units that are affordable, and we are interested in naturally occurring affordable housing. So if those sound like the 3 things that keep coming up, right? Affordability, naturally affordable, as opposed to subsidized, because if it's subsidized, you're potentially getting some income from other places. And income really matters to the landlord. So if those are the things on the income piece, it sounds like we can check it. We might have to ask for their tax returns, but we can check it. If I'm understanding that correctly, is that not true?
It's really tricky because can we check a 1040 for a personal business owner? Yes, potentially. It creates definite, much heavier barrier than asking for a Schedule E.
Yeah.
Then it starts getting really complex when you're asking staff to check, okay, what's the percentage of the income they've reported? And
Yeah.
the
Okay.
tax
So then it sounds
complication.
to me like we have hit a wall. We have hit a fork in the road, if I'm understanding this correctly, and we have to make a decision. It sounds like we can either go one direction, which is prioritize income, like the role that rents play in income, in which case we have to do what you just described, the 1040, and go down that path. Or if there's not another way to confirm the role that rent plays in income, we have to not prioritize income as a part of their rent, right? So that to me sounds like just an unfortunate decision we have to make. And it sounds to me like you're saying administratively, it's very difficult. So while we may all want that may not be possible. So holding on to that for a second, it sounds to me then like that, if that's one of our 3 criteria, that criteria is out, let's say. So then the next one is naturally occurring affordable housing. And you, Marianne, just gave us a least imperfect definition, sounds like, which are census tracts. So maybe we can hold on to that one by prioritizing for the initial funding units that are in those census tracts. So let's just put a pin in that. And then if our third is that it is genuinely affordable, that was another one where it sounded to me like we basically can't do that calculation because we don't know the unit size, we don't have the lease information. And so here again, we potentially hit a fork in the road. We can, we can't, it doesn't sound like prioritize affordability based on the data we have. So what I would propose, if all of that information is correct, and accounting for my personal bias for a lower number of units, I would suggest that we have this program available to landlords who have fewer than 20 units in target census tracts. And if there's money left over, maybe we raise the cap to 18 or we raise the cap to 20. And that's it. And then if there's money left over, we can expand it to other areas. I do agree with Joanne said that it's more important that the units are serving LMI populations than that they're located in LMI census tracts, is what I think I heard Joanne say. Even if not, I believe that, but I don't think we have an easy way to do that. And I just think we can't let perfect be the enemy of good. So that's my proposal. Target census tracts, smaller unit count, because I do think those are more likely to be reaching deeper into the LMI population, maybe 18 to 20 to make more meaningful support based on what we're hearing. And I know the survey data was there too. I get it, but we won't, we'll have the tax information so we can ratchet it up. We don't have to give everyone that much. And then just see how it goes. That's my vote.
Joanne.
I agree with Lauren. Can we ask people to, without asking for their tax returns and just going on, hopefully they're telling us the truth of what are your other sources of income? And can you estimate what percentage of your rents are a portion of your income? And then not ask for the tax returns, but Lauren said is good. I mean, there's just no easy solution here, and
there isn't.
And we don't want to get too invasive in the kinds of questions we ask. So Councilmember Burns.
My understanding that is in most rental assistance programs, it is pretty standard to check a lease. And so I do not, unless I missed something, what is the concern about checking a lease?
It's not really a concern when you're, and yes, usually we get a lease from the landlord. It's not necessarily, we're not concerned about checking the lease. It's checking the lease against understanding the size of the unit and trying to understand how to check that and multiplying that with the different number of units. So when you do rent assistance, there's one application for one unit. When we're talking about landlord assistance, there may be one unit, but we have to think about the design of what that's going to look like when a landlord is applying and he's got 10 units or 15 units or 20 units, having to provide every single lease, keep track of each leases against each unit size, and then understanding whether we want to put a threshold on how many units are affordable or not affordable. Do they all need to be affordable? It's doable, but it definitely multiplies the level of complexity when you're both advertising the program and when you're implementing it and the processing timeline of getting the money out.
My experience, at least in the Fifth Ward, and I get probably way more involved in these matters than I should, but it is what it is, trying to make a difference. But is that you won't have a building where one of the units is market rate and the other is affordable and the other is market rate and the other is, it's just, they're either affordable because there's a voucher involved, a subsidy involved, or they're just all naturally occurring, affordable housing where it's priced affordably and it's consistent. Because why would one person pay a different rate for a 2-bedroom than someone else outside of, minor adjustments? If they've been grandfathered in and been there a while, maybe there's some, they're paying a slightly lower amount than someone who is just coming in and experiencing, kind of an increase. But for the most part, everybody is kind of priced similarly. And I think trying to understand, I think it's easy enough to do I would imagine, to just check a lease to make sure that, generally speaking, and we can come up with what that threshold is, that there's a certain percentage or whatever, however we look at it, of affordable, we can use AMI or whatever we want to use for that, but that there are generally affordable units being rented out in that apartment building. I think that, we should be able to find a way to do that.
There are thresholds we can use, absolutely, as far as the actual rent level. I think the documentation part creates some issues. But as far as the threshold, there's threshold we had thought about that we could potentially use. Yes.
And I don't know if this is a big enough program to warrant some support from some of our providers who do this on a regular basis, who provide rental assistance, support on a regular basis, who might be able to help not only guide us, but even support us in administering this. I don't know if we've reached out to any of those providers to see if they could support us at all, especially in the administration of it.
We haven't reached out. I would say that based on my experience as far as implementing that kind of support, it's at the point we're at right now, it's very likely to increase the timeline of when we could release fund, because we would have to start those conversations, negotiate whether they even have the bandwidth to take that on, which isn't sure. That could potentially postpone things.
And then if somebody has, have we considered what happens? This is a deviation from that, but if someone has open, violations with the city, as an example, are they still eligible to receive funds? Property standards violations?
I would think not.
Yeah.
Well, that might
Not
be based on the severity of them. I mean, I think that if somebody has been, if somebody has very minor ones that from an inspection and things like outlet covers missing and stuff like that.
Right.
But I do think that if we've got some of the real problems that we've been dealing with and hauling somebody into adjudication or court and not getting responses, I think that those would absolutely be rolled out.
Okay. Something I think worth considering, and having down in the guidelines, so it's clear.
Yes,
And
very
then I
good
think
point.
going from 35, I think we surveyed landlords who have up to 35 units to 16 or 18. I can't remember what was said is a pretty big jump. You know, I think maybe 25 units, but I think that's a pretty big jump. We went out, we surveyed up to 35 just to cut them off. I think makes me a little uneasy, but you know, I'd feel more comfortable going from 35 to 25. But that's where I'm at. And that's all for now. Thank you.
Yeah. And it is getting to be past our bedtime. So I think what we're saying is we're going to focus on geographic areas. You used a different word, Marion, than census tracts. Whichever one is whatever's going to get us into targeted parts of the community where in general there's more naturally occurring affordable housing. So we target those areas. We compare the
2019 to 2021.
2019 and 2021. And have we decided whether it's looking at the rental income versus the overall
Result.
result?
I haven't heard a consensus on that.
Any quick thoughts on one or the other?
Mariam, could you explain the two just one more
Sure.
time, please?
Yeah. So the choice is whether we're looking at the delta between the perceived rents, so the rental income difference, or whether we're looking at the delta between the actual financial result, which would include perceived rents as well as expenses and depreciation, which means that in that scenario, we're including the potential for increased expenses occurred due to COVID, or not due to COVID, but just increased expenses between 2019 and 2021. So that's a fuller picture of the actual business results, but it does include all expenses.
I think I'd rather go with the latter and include increase in expenses too.
That is what we were looking at and had suggested in our memo.
So
for the various reasons that we've mentioned in the conversation.
So I'm wondering whether the committee we've given direction now, I hope, and ask you to revise the program in a memo for us to think about and then vote on at our next meeting.
Sure.
So then we've had a chance to really think it through again.
Yeah.
Because I want us to be really confident in what we're proposing when it goes off to council, so we, explain how it's going to work and make it sound like we know what we're talking about.
I also wanted to note that I heard the number of units in those low mod income census tracts, not their total units, was one of the things that I believe I heard. Is that something I'm more correct on?
Wow.
I think that was Lauren. I think Lauren, you said that. You're on mute.
Sorry, that I cared about the percentage of units in LMI areas?
No, I wrote down landlords based on the number of units in the target low mod areas.
Oh, well, this is when I was trying to get more money in, when I was saying we could scale it up and have bonuses for more. I do agree, I will say, with what Councilmember Burns was saying about if they're charging one rent. I mean, I think on projects that on buildings this small, they are unlikely to have subsidy that would force them to have a range of market rents. That's probably true.
So I've heard that the total units should be lowered to 20 to 25. Is there consensus on that?
I mean, I suggested that, and I totally get what Councilmember Burns is saying, that if they reached out to people up to 35. So, and it sounds like there were only 3 above 25 anyway.
We reached out to everyone. It just so happened we got results from 3 people that were above 20, but we reach out to all landlords regardless of size.
I just feel personally like there is likely to be a correlation. The smaller the number of units held by any one person, the more likely that landlord is to be serving LMI populations if we are targeting certain areas, which is part of my argument for lowering the number of units they can have. But I was not on the committee that worked on this, and I don't want to undermine that work. So if other people feel strongly, I'm not going to fight on it at all.
What is LMI?
Low mod income.
Okay, that's what I was to mention. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I agree with
I would-
Lauren on that,
yeah.
on the number of units.
Okay. So we can come back with a revised plan, and then my hope is that by then we should also have a little bit more information from our legal
Right.
counsel / CPA on how to handle multiple ownership and trickier layers of information that we've got to deal with.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for this really important discussion. This
Yeah.
is very complicated. So I guess my question is, do we need to do the other things on this agenda, or can we just adjourn? I mean, as long as everybody knows that in December, we want to move our meeting date to the 2nd Tuesday in the month and not the 3rd Tuesday, we can actually officially vote on that.
Yes, it would be
Could
the
we-
13th and not the 20th. The
Yeah, it's a
20th
good idea.
is-
Yeah.
Good idea.
So we can officially vote on that next month.
Yes,
Okay.
but we could maybe make sure that nobody else tries to put a meeting on that date to conflict with us.
Okay, well, let's have a quick motion.
Let's
Can I-
vote.
can I
Yeah,
have
let's just
A
vote.
motion to reschedule our December meeting to the 2nd Tuesday of the month.
So moved.
And a second.
Second.
Okay, do we have a quick roll call?
Yes. Chair Ravel,
Aye.
Councilmember Hedicaris,
Aye.
Councilmember Burns,
Aye.
Joanne Salome,
Aye.
Lauren Berlin.
Aye.
Okay,
So motion passes.
great, thank you.
Great.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and we will deal with some of the issues that were on our agenda at our next meeting, and I call us adjourned. Oh, and our next meeting is November 15th, so see you
Yes.
all then.
And it
And
will
I'm
be a
gonna have to
very-
figure out how to do it from
Oh,
my work
and-
trip.
Yeah, it will be a very long agenda, just
Next
word
time.
of warning. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Oh, well, okay, but we
Okay.
did good work tonight, so thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, all right,
Thank you for
Okay.
such a robust discussion and so many good considerations.
right, yeah, okay. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.